past president of Bay Area Skeptics, and also he is a past president of the San Francisco Psychological Association. He is a practicing clinical psychologist, and does work for various institutions in the Bay Area. And something I didn't know when he sent me his little bio sketch here is that he joined a cult to get the data for his doctoral dissertation. Who knew? The title of Patrick's talk is False Confessions. Patrick.
Okay, well, I am delighted to speak here. To mention about the cult, I did join a cult to get the data for my dissertation because it was the only way I could get the data. My doctoral committee said I could not lie to them. Well, for any of the Catholics out there, what I did was a venial sin, not a mortal sin. When they asked me why I wanted to join, I said I was doing graduate studies on alternative religious expression. And they said, that's a perfectly good reason. Well, so I joined. And I was there about 8 months. And it was really horrible. Because I liked the people. They were nice people, and they liked me. And I wasn't in a position where I could say, you I got to get out of here. But what's interesting is a couple of years after I finished my dissertation, I started getting phone calls from ex-members of that group who had somehow learned about my dissertation. I was going to write a book about it because that's what everybody wants to do after they do a dissertation. But the last day I was there, I thought I was going to get beat up, so let somebody else do it. Anyway, about false confessions. They're quite prevalent. I worked on 2 cases. One with this very pleasant, timid, dependent personality young man. Ultimately was pressured into confessing to have sexually abused over 25 developmentally disabled children. It didn't happen. He went to prison, he got a good attorney, went to an appellate court, and I testified. I explained why he could not possibly have done it. I remember it really well because the DA had a name as Irish as mine, and she frequently screamed at me during court. Anyway, I will talk about it. The Central Park Five was a very famous one. Ironically, I was hired to do a false confession assessment on a school teacher who was then at Rikers Island, who had falsely confessed to abusing his students. He really didn't do it, but considering that the Central Park Five is a very famous case, it turns out that New York City does not allow false confession testimony. So my evaluation was for naught. The Central Park Five, that was a really central one. It was a major one where 5 teenagers of color confessed to the horrible crime of viciously assaulting and raping a woman in Central Park in 1989, and they were sent to prison. Over a decade later, they were released when the real perpetrator confessed to the crime, and the DNA evidence substantiated the confession. Each of the 4 or 5 teenagers received $7 million in settlement. It left her in a coma for 12 days. Media was all over it. I mean, I live in California, and it was front page news here. There were 4 blacks and 1 Hispanic. Right? Actually, this is not political. I'm not making a political comment, but at the time there was a famous real estate developer named Donald Trump who actually he spent over $85,000 placing full-page ads in all the New York newspapers. He was calling for the death penalty for them. Like you said, they admitted they were guilty. The police doing the original investigation say they were guilty. The fact that the case was settled with so much evidence against them is outrageous. And the woman so badly injured will never be the same, which that part is absolutely true. Some interesting information about false confessions. 63 50% of the confessors were under the age of 25, 32% under 18, 22% were developmentally disabled, and 10% had a diagnosed mental illness. Really going after the vulnerable. So why do they make false confessions? For a lot of reasons: duress, coercion, intoxication, diminished capacity, mental impairment, ignorance of the law, fear of violence, and the threat of a harder sentence if they don't confess. And confessions from juveniles are often unreliable. Our brains aren't even fully developed to where in our early 20s, and children can be easy to manipulate. They're not always fully aware of their situation. There was a review, interestingly, of 10 years of murder cases in just one Illinois county alone, identified 247 confessions were thrown out because they were false. And there's 3 forms of false confession. There's a voluntary false confession, coerced compliant false confession, coerced internalized false confession. I'll explain what those are. Voluntary, here's a man, for instance, he confessed to the murder of over 600 people. His confession falls into the voluntary category. It was
well, yes, sir. One of the 2 of us. Is that seat taken?
So we're fine if you want to
You
get
think it
Why do
is?
they do that?
You're fine. You're good. Go ahead.
Because they lack the ability to distinguish reality from fantasy, sometimes to protect the real culprit. And they might just confess because they feel that other things that they've done that they've not been caught at.
This is on
Interesting guy here.
There's
Yep, we're fine.
Professor, psychologist. He's based in England. He's done intensive research on false confessions, and in fact, there's one actually psychological test which is really reliable that he did is in fact for false confessions. And as he says, some individuals have a high level of generalized guilt, and that may influence a range of their behaviors, including the need to voluntarily confess to something they didn't do. See? Interesting one from a historical standpoint. He claimed to have thrown a bomb through a bakery window which caused a major fire in London. He actually hadn't been in England at the time of the fire. The bakery had no windows. He was physically disabled and unable to throw a bomb. However, he was a foreigner and a Catholic, and he was hanged just the same. Voluntary confessions. In August 2016, John Mark Carter confessed to the December 26, 1996 murder of 6-year-old John Benet Ramsey. His DNA didn't match. It was a blurring of fantasy and reality, which can cause could be one of the major problems with false confessions. We know, I'm quoting, we know that Carr had immersed himself in the facts of this case, said Professor Casson, also an authority on false confessions. News reports described how Carr emailed a Colorado professor to confess to his involvement in the crime, when in fact he did not do it at all. Excuse me. It's not moving.
Hang on. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Here we go. Oh, we ran backwards. I'm going to go forward. Please bear with me. I'm in Google and I am not a computer person. All right. All right. Okay. There's something called imagination inflation, where your mind is the scene of the crime. When people repeatedly imagine an event over and over and over again, they become less certain about whether it was real or not. Professor Casson said the memory research on this is clear. It's called imagination inflation. It can occur by individuals repeatedly picturing a past event that didn't happen, and causes them to believe it actually did happen. Examples are they were called repressed memories, false memories. that are actually false, and false confessions to crimes that actually weren't committed by the individual. We already looked at that. Compliant false confessions. As you can see, the suspect has a more concrete reason to confess to a crime that he or she did not do. It's usually to escape a bad situation, to avoid a threat, implied or real, or to gain some kind of reward. Also to escape from a stressful situation, avoid punishment, or to gain a promised reward. These are often a result of the particular interrogation techniques that the police use. So here the individual falsely confesses to the crime but holds an internal belief about his innocence or her innocence. It's caused by social influence interviewees who want to end the questioning, and those who want to please the interviewer and who want to avoid being locked up. One of the Central Park Five, those teenagers, when asked why he confessed, he said, well, because I thought I could go home after I confessed. He ended up going to prison, of course. I think most people here are aware of the Stanley Milgram study, which is so unspeakably unethical you could never do it now. Does anybody want a little elaboration on the Milgram study? People do know it. Okay, that's fine. It's kind of part of our canon. Coerced internalized false confession. Some suspects, through exhaustion and suggestibility, actually come to believe that they really are guilty of the crime, even though, in fact, they're not. The case I worked with way up in one of the northern counties here in California, where the young man confessed to having sexually abused all these developmentally disabled children. For a while, he actually came to believe it. He was 3/4 deaf, so he had something implanted in his head so he could hear. He didn't have any friends. His mother was a evangelical Baptist, and he was gay and couldn't tell anybody, so he was particularly vulnerable. Some confessors are confused, exhausted, feel pressure, and are then subjected to remarkable, intense, suggestive methods of interrogation. I did work on a case in Southern California a few years ago, and I actually got to watch the whole police interview, and it went on for hours and hours and hours. He just became totally confused. He was not a very literate man. He's 18 years old, just screwed up in school his whole life, and joined a gang, and it never occurred to him to say, I need a lawyer. This is an interesting one. Nadine Krull. She was a nurse's aide in Wisconsin, and she sought therapy from a psychiatrist to help her cope with her PTSD. During the therapy, the psychiatrist used hypnosis and other suggestive techniques to dig out buried memories of abuse that Krull herself had allegedly experienced. She came to believe that she'd been in a satanic cult, had eaten babies, and watched babies being murdered. Of course, it didn't happen. Ultimately, she sued the psychiatrist because she got another therapist who told her, really this is nonsense, and she did get a multi-million-dollar settlement, and the psychiatrist lost his license to practice. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a very familiar name, I think, to most people here. She did an experiment with children where she planted a specific memory of being lost in a shopping mall around the age of 5. Then she had a booklet for each participant containing one-paragraph stories about 3 events that had actually happened to him or her, and one that had not. 25% of those children continued to insist that it really happened, that they had in fact been lost in a shopping mall. Well, that's with children. Professors tend to use their students as their subjects, no big surprise there. The false confessions have 2 things in common: a malleable memory due to naivety, suggestibility, stress, fatigue, substance abuse for a young age. A presence of false evidence, statements by an alleged accomplice, or fake eyewitness identification. He did an experiment. College students were getting a minimum wage for being part of this experiment. They were asked to type letters on a keyboard as a researcher read them out loud. Half of the students typed quickly and the other half typed slowly. They were warned not to touch the Alt key because due to a defect in the computer, it would crash if the Alt key was pressed. 1 minute into the test, the computer was manually caused to crash. Approximately 30% of the students insisted, I should say that when that happened, the professor pretended to be irritated, and they were asked to confess that they had in fact pressed the Alt key, even if they'd done it accidentally, and approximately 30% of the students confessed that they had in fact done it. 28% rather, excuse me. None of them were. Who was vulnerable? Low IQ, people with anxiety disorders, like in a picture somebody with generalized anxiety disorder sitting during a police interrogation. It would be unspeakably horrible. People with affective disorders, that means people who tend to be either depressed or manic. People with personality disorders, borderline personality comes to mind, dependent personality comes to mind. A suspect is intensely worried or anxious about another matter, may confess just to get out of the current situation, or you might even begin to doubt his or her own memory. People with poor assertiveness and anxiety are more likely to make a confession. Who can spot the liar? Interestingly, there's been so many studies about how to recognize a lie. Every now and again I see something on Google, I say it, on Google, what the hell, very Google, and it'll say,
They won't care.
Yeah, they won't care, where take this, here's how you can detect if somebody's lying. Well, actually, it's not true. Police investigators, FBI, law enforcement, they're not able to tell lies from the truth much better, more than anybody in this room. But they're extremely confident that they do, in fact, have the ability. It's interesting, the late Professor Maureen O'Sullivan at the University of San Francisco, who I met, and actually had hosted her for a Commonwealth Club talk once. She spent decades studying lies, and she actually had this interesting little video that I took the test, I failed it, and where you're going to tell when the person is lying. She tested over 13,000 people, only 31 of them were adept at significantly recognizing the lie. And the ones who are most successful actually are Secret Service. So if you ever watch, I grew up in an extremely Irish Catholic family, Catholic education. My parents were devout. So when Pope John Paul II came to California in 1987, was it, I think, my father called me and he says, I can't get off work, but you're going to go see the Pope, right? And I said, yeah, I'm going to go there, sure. But I did. Actually, I went with my old altar boy partner, who's a hardcore atheist, but we went. And what I noticed is we were both tall guys, and there was 100,000 people there at least. It was out at the in Monterey County at the racetrack, and we got up front behind the cyclone fence. My friend was joking because if anybody who was an altar boy would know, sometimes he would go to mass in the morning. The priest would come out before the mass, and then he'd point to you because an altar boy didn't show up. So it was a really big deal. We got like $1 million when that happened. And so my friend said, well, let's get up front in case one of the altar boys doesn't show up. But as it happened, there were plenty of altar boys. But what I noticed then, I started watching the Secret Service because he's actually, a foreign dignitary. And their eyes are always scanning. They're looking for the most minute thing that looks off. So if you do watch a foreign dignitary, a politician, president, ex-president doing a talk, you might want to just watch the Secret Service because they're always scanning the audience. Neurosis is often very, very strongly connected with suggestibility, particularly state anxiety. State anxiety is a transitory emotional state or condition that is characterized by subjective, consciously perceived feelings of tension and apprehension. But that's transitory. It could go away. You could be really anxious about something you have to do, but once you do it, like you do in a presentation, once the presentation's over, you go back to normal. Trait anxiety is something that's really built into the person's personality. So they're anxious all the time. I've met a few, both personally and in my profession. They're particularly vulnerable to this because they can't stand the stress of the interrogation. Dependent personality, that one particularly, because somebody with this personality has difficulty making everyday decisions, has to lean on other people, has difficulty expressing disagreement with others because of fear of loss of support from the person. They're really dependent on other people. They can't make a cogent argument and stick to it if somebody challenges them. There we go. As I said, needs others to assume responsibility for most major areas of his or her life. There's a standard police interrogation technique called the Reed technique, and I bought the book on it because when I was preparing this, actually I did this for the Alameda Bar Association a few years ago, but this was a little more interesting, I think. And it's a way to make the person feel helpless. They don't accept a denial. There are no windows in the interrogation room. There's nothing in there. There's no stimuli at all. And it goes on and on and on for hours. And it gets the suspect to recount the details of his or her crime, even if the person didn't do it. Just imagine you did it. How would you do it? It's a pretty insidious form of interrogation. I once had a doctoral student who was a police officer, and he said, "Yeah, it's horrible." That was his assessment of it. Here's some more of it. Absolutely, totally positive that the person is guilty. Won't let the person try to explain. Again, the room is totally without any kind of stimuli. They often give an alternative explanation. Okay, I know you did it, but I understand there was a lot of pressure on you. That person was giving you a bad time, and you were in financial trouble. They try to make it less severe than it really is. Again, I watched that interrogation. It went on for hours for that 18-year-old kid down in Southern California. And as I was watching it, I know I was watching it on, I had a DVD of it, but I kept thinking through it. Just, good God, man, just ask for a lawyer. Just stop. And he wouldn't because he didn't actually know any better. Demand characteristics of police interrogation. Privacy, they're totally alone with the suspect. There's nobody else there. An environment that minimizes sensory stimulation. Maximally exposes the suspect's vulnerability, and they control and dominate the person being interrogated. There's a few assessments. There may be some psychologists here who already know this. When I have done these assessments for people, I generally use the MMPI and the Milan because they've been shown to be valid and reliable as far as coming up with an accurate diagnosis. So it's helpful to know if the person has a personality disorder. Is that person borderline? Is that person dependent personality? The Good-Johnson suggestibility scales, which I'll talk about in a minute, we're just about done, is very helpful. Incidentally, when I say something is valid, a test is valid when it measures what it's supposed to measure. reliability means that it has consistency. So if I do MMPI on somebody and they've done it correctly, if another psychologist does one a week later, it should be just about the same as mine. Okay, let's explain that. There's also a screening test called the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, which determines if the person has state anxiety just temporarily because they're in a police station, or because they're just always anxious. This one's the important one because the Johnson suggestibility scales is very helpful. Yielding, so what they do with this test, which I had ordered from England, so they would read a short little story, maybe just a couple paragraphs, and then they have to take then there's a test on it to see how accurate their memory is. But some of the questions are leading. So let's say the pregnant woman in the test was wearing a yellow dress. So the question would be, was the woman's dress green or blue? Well, it was neither. It was, well, now I already forgot which one I used. I think I said yellow, but they asked these questions. The people in this room, if they got that question, say, well, it's neither of those. So then they take this test, and even if they did well on it, the person administrating it, in that case me, would say, you missed a lot of the questions, so let's try it again. Let's see if you can remember. And so I would read all the questions out to them, and they would change their answers, even the correct answers. So somebody who does that is extremely suggestible. And that's all, so thanks. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes.
You mentioned the 31 wizards of the 31,000.
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Oh, yes, she interviewed 13,000.
13,000. So,
yeah, yes.
yeah, my question again, the 31 wizards.
Yeah.
Is that the street?
Oh, want to go back?
Oh, sorry.
Just go ask your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 13,000 that were
Yeah.
in the study. So were they statistically significant in their rightness, and was there some traits? You mentioned Secret Service agents. They weren't all Secret Service agents, were they? So whether
no, they weren't. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I apologize. Were you still?
What was there traits that were identified that were special across all 31?
But what she found is the Secret Service people overwhelmingly did really well in the lives. She found other people doing it as well. They just had that level of perception where they could notice a little idiosyncrasy, a little behavior, like the test that I took it. She gave the test to everybody in the Commonwealth Club, and she had a full house. So I took it to her. I introduced her. I got to take it, and she showed a video, and then we were asked, at what point was he lying? What parts in here were not true? Nobody in the Commonwealth Club, and it was probably 60 people in there, got it right. But then she pointed out what it was. They were little idiosyncrasies in the man. When he lied, there was a certain different way his eyes moved, or he kind of tensed up in a very subtle way that wasn't easily recognizable. Some people have the gift to do that. I'm hypothesizing because I don't know for a fact, but I suspect that Secret Service is trained to look for that kind of stuff constantly. But I still remember them just scanning the audience. They're looking for somebody reaching into his pocket, somebody swearing to himself, or somebody looking around. I don't know exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for something that didn't fit, in other words. Some of the people a handful of those people that she tested have nothing to do with law enforcement. Somebody in this audience might have been one of them. So there could be a wizard in our midst right now as we speak. But interesting, the question, I was expecting profound questions from the audience, and I didn't get them. The most common was, how can I tell if my boyfriend's cheating? That was, that one came up a lot. Well, I enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Yeah, oh, there's not, I've got another question, sir. Yeah. Mather.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering if, so things like the Reed technique, strong evidence,
Yeah.
don't do this. Are there, have any police systems developed techniques of interviewing people who may be suspected of a crime that aren't leading them down a primrose path, that are more, that are reliable and valid?
There could be, and I don't know the answer. My thinking is they would likely, my big belief is that the guy getting interrogated should have a lawyer with him. Okay, I don't know of any, I'm sorry, that's not an area of expertise of mine. The Reed one is the normal one, the one I watched for hours that they were doing the Reed. But there could be some new developments. That's a good question. Next time I do this talk, I'll know the answer. How's that? Yes, ma'am.
Ask the damsels there
Yeah.
next to you, please.
Hi. I have a friend who's a public official who was subjected to a civil grand jury investigation. What do you think of those in general?
Oh, God, it's all secrecy. That's the grand jury.
Civil grand jury, I felt there was so much bias and
Oh.
suggestibility there.
Yeah,
It was a circus, in my opinion. They didn't find anything
Oh,
wrong.
good. He was not allowed to have a lawyer, and there was just him. The deck is stacked pretty heavily against anybody who has to go into a grand jury.
Thank you, that was.
If it was, if he was accused of something, I presume he got an attorney. Attorney couldn't go into the grand jury with him.
Nope.
Well, he was a trusting soul. She was, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I should have said he or she.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
I've been seeing it used, I think, as a political tool.
Yeah.
So.
Decades ago, I knew the head of the grand jury in Alameda County personally. And if I had to make a list of the 100 smartest people I ever met in my life, he would not make that list.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think the whole system needs to be overhauled.
Yeah.
So.
Pass it to the ladies
Yes.
and teachers.
In California now, as you said, children are very susceptible, and they do have attorneys now.
Yeah.
The police are not allowed to interview somebody under the age of 18 unless they have called and talked to their attorney,
Yeah.
who then tells them, don't say anything.
Yes, that's very good, absolutely. When I mentioned the person I watched the interview with, he was had just turned 18. Never been, he was Blonde gang, but he was a little guy. I think he joined just for protection. And he never asked for a lawyer. By the way, it turns out that it was clear he hadn't done it, but as it happens, they found the real culprit with him. So he spent months in jail. He was I'll just say something that was very moving to me because his attorney said, well, he likes talking to you, Dr. Rodney. Could you just go out there maybe every 3 or 4 weeks and just spend an hour or so and take notes because it could be useful to me. He had a very good attorney. And the last time I saw him, he'd been in this county jail for like 6 or 8 months. And he said, you know, Doc, what I found out is that, and this is his perception, I'm not saying it's accurate. He says, I see white guys come in here and they spend a few days or a week and then they get out because they got lawyers. Usually the only people here are Hispanic or black, so when I get out, even if I have to go to jail or prison, when I get out, I'm going to become a lawyer and just represent black and Hispanic people. I don't know if he did that or not. This was about 7 years ago. Any more questions? What? Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you hear me like this?
Yeah, but you'll have the mic in a moment.
So you were discussing coercions applied to potential criminals. What about coercions of purported victims? And I'm thinking of these cases that occurred, I believe, in Bakersfield, where people were accused of child molestation because the children themselves were coerced into making accusations. Can you speak a little bit
Well,
about
as a psychologist, I've worked with countless dozens over the last decades of men and women who were sexually abused as children. So it absolutely, it certainly happens. That's a very tricky one. Because often the children would have a social worker present as well. I respect social workers. The work they do is very important. Social workers are not required. If there's a social worker in here, forgive me ahead of time. I really love social workers. I worked with my whole career, but they don't have to take any research methodology courses to be a social worker. But a lawyer representing the parents on that has a tough road, because you want to believe the kids, and because we know that it does happen. The social worker, the attorney might, I'm trying to hypothesize here, the attorney might well get a child psychologist to meet with the child, clearly with the child's attorney or parent present, to find out exactly how they ended up confessing to that, because there was a technique that was done in the 90s that was very common with children, and it came up with false positives. They in fact weren't, then not it happened. It was implied. People suspected it, and through a series of leading questions, they came to believe it. Children are sexually abused all the time. I worked at Coalinga State Hospital for 18 months. That's a state hospital for sex offenders. The vast majority of them were pedophiles. A few of them denied it, but they were lying. But most of them acknowledged it happened, that they had in fact done it. I would say, get a good lawyer. That's the best advice I could give on that. A lawyer would know what to do. A lawyer would know what psychologist is most qualified to do an evaluation, for instance.
If I could just make a quick comment. I think there's probably a difference between coercing. Sorry. There's probably a difference between coercing a child and planting a false memory, either of which would have the same effect of a false accusation. But coercing a child is particularly heinous. But even, an interview technique that ends up implanting a false memory also has a very bad result. But it's not quite as venal, as it were. The intent is not there.
Okay.
So it's a tough question.
Thank you for that. You're right, absolutely. The confessions that have turned out to be false, they had to do with leading questions. Often I watched a video some years ago of somebody I'd been hired to do an evaluation of, and they were all false confessions. I mean, they were all leading questions. Well, tell me, what when Mr. Smith is with you alone, does he ever hug you or just pat you on the shoulder? Yeah, sometimes he'll pat me on the shoulder or shake my hand, but sometimes does he hold you for longer periods of time? It was such an incredibly horrible, egregious manipulation of a child. Was not a psychologist who did that. We have our bad apples, but fortunately that wasn't one of them. I think that's it. Thank you very much.